Thank you for joining us for today's event. My name is Bree Hogue, and I'm the sales manager of Powell's Books here in Portland, Oregon. This afternoon, we are really excited to welcome back Dr. Faith G. Harper and Joe Biel. Harper is a badass, funny lady with a PhD. She's a licensed professional counselor, board supervisor, certified sexologist, and applied clinical nutritionist with a private practice and consulting business in San Antonio, Texas. She's been an adjunct professor and a TEDx presenter and proudly identifies as a woman of color and an uppity intersectional, feminist. Misread that one. Sorry, just adding things to your bio, Faith. She's the author of the book Unfuck Your Brain and many other popular zines and books on subjects such as anxiety, depression, and grief. Joe Biel is a self-made publisher and filmmaker who draws origins, inspiration, and methods from punk rock. He's the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing and co-founder of the Portland Zine Symposium. He's the author of several books and the director of 5 feature films and hundreds of short films. Dr. Harper and Biel join us today to present 3 new books, including their jointly authored new workbook, How to Be Accountable. Harper also presents her 2 other books, Unfuck Your Worth and Unfuck Your Year. Today's event will include an audience Q&A, so if you do have a question for Joe or Faith, you can submit it by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will remind you that you can submit your questions anonymously, so if you do have a more sensitive question, you should see a button that says submit anonymously. Click on that and your name will not be attached to the question. So please do submit all questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But first, we're going to start out with a conversation between Joe and Faith. You can also support both of the authors by buying a copy of their book from powells.com. I'm going to post a link in our chat function tonight that will show you the links to get to those books at powells.com. I will also mention that we are having a promotion right now of 20% off, so it's a great day to order those books. Faith, Joe, it's such a pleasure to have you both here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Excellent. So about 5, maybe even 6 years ago, I received an email from a person I did not know who said that she had been a longtime customer, first-time submitter to our publishing house, Microcosm. And she said, that she essentially sent us a PowerPoint presentation, which is not normally how we take book pitches. And we had not a tremendous amount of success with mental health books in years past, but I don't know what it was, but something about it felt like it was time. And then she was getting married and she was coming to Portland for her honeymoon. And
as one does, yes.
I would say almost that we took the meeting against all policy odds and logic because her future husband was named Joe as well, but we made it work. And 20, 30, who can even remember how many books later, we've had a tremendous amount of success. And her first book, I did find a first printing on my shelf at home today, which I did not know that I had, which is very exciting. And because, we just got the 12th printing back of this book. So, it's exciting to remember where you come from sometimes. And, and so it's really been a pleasure to really become friends with Faith over these years, much more so even than publishing associates.
So I'm supposed to now introduce you, right? So we met at the same time. So I need to tell people, I didn't physically send you a PowerPoint because now you're going to get PowerPoints. They're going to be like, oh, shit, well, that works. I did send, so I had been a fan of Microcosm for some time period. While you hadn't published a lot in the mental health range in terms of books, I used a lot of your zines. The zines about consent and boundaries and sort of speaking from that lived experience perspective, and your stuff just tended to be more queer inclusive. And I was tired of like having to take these very, normative workbooks and like hack them for clients. So I used your stuff a lot. And I'd even like sent you love notes in the past, like not like creepy at your window love notes, but hey, thank you for doing what you, and you had responded to those. Like you don't remember that, but he's like, this
I
is
really
new.
don't.
Yeah. I mean, I was just a fan saying, hey, thanks for doing what you do. And you're like, hey, you're welcome. So cool. And so I had been working in community mental health, decided to move into private practice and teaching and consulting because I wanted to write a book, like, which is everybody's goal. And we should probably do less of that. It worked out well for me, though. That was not the book I was intending to write. I was working on what's now the intimacy book, the Unfuck Your Intimacy, which we should now hold up, but we don't have in front of us. And that was the book that I had like written a formal pitch for and was submitting and being told very nicely and very politely to fuck off by a lot of publishing companies. And I had sat down and had written out at one point. So all of my clients would get like this, I call it your brain is an asshole speech, like this 5 minutes of brain science explaining trauma reactions. And I had written that out thinking like, oh, I'll make a pamphlet or something. So I can be like, hey, I really want you to remember this. This is what we're working around. And I was literally like sitting at a coffee shop, got a wild hair at my ass to send it to y'all. Like, this is kind of microcosm-y. I wonder if they do something with it. And I sent it out into the abyss and y'all responded. And like within a week, and I think, I don't know if it was you or Ellie that responded, and you're like, we've never seen like anything like this. We actually went to Powell's and we were kind of looking through like the comps and this is different. I'm like, yeah, that tends to be the problem. Nobody else wants different.
Mm-hmm.
Different is uncomfortable for publishing companies. And you're like, well, we want to develop this with you. Cause it really was like, just like you said, it was essentially like, this is the presentation on how I explain the brain. And yeah, and then I'm like, well, I am, I think we talked about like doing a phone meeting or something. And I'm like, well, I'll be up there. And you're like, well, she's a therapist, so she probably has pretty good boundaries. Like, she's not going to be super creepy if we invite her over. And you're like, do you really want to do that on your honeymoon? Like, yeah, my husband's a writer too. He'll be fine. And of course, and he's also Joe. And, when we went up there, we had the meeting and we did some development stuff. And then you and he ended up spending like another 2 hours hanging out. And I left and Ellie left. And y'all were having a cuddle upstairs in the offices. And I think I went shopping and I eventually picked him up later when Ellie's like, I want to go have dinner. Y'all need to leave. So of course now he writes stuff for y'all too. But yeah, I think we kind of became friends pretty quickly, or at least you and Joe did. And so you decided that you had to be friends with me since you're friends with my husband.
We decided to include you as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. He's the cool one. I'm the nice one. Is kind of the dynamic there. Yeah.
And it was a good, you don't always get, I feel like the origin story is not always so colloquial, though I feel like if I was listening, I would take the takeaway of this as like, when you are a reader of a press and you send thank you notes and love notes, it has a great outcome for everyone.
Yeah.
I feel like that is what I would hear. But, I feel like I should also mention that tomorrow is both Faith and my birthday, because we have the same birthday somehow, because
we're twins. We're actually secret twins. And the meeting was our recognition of that actually, yes. Yeah, you taken a DNA test, realized that, and then you decided to publish me because we're twins. Yeah.
Right. So, if there was ever synchronicity, it is here for certain. And then, so, some years had gone by, and your memory is probably different of this than mine. We had done, essentially when Unfuck Your Brain did really well, we did This Is Your Brain on Anxiety, and we did quite a few more different little things. And then we did eventually publish your original book proposal, Unfuck Your Intimacy. And then I think we kind of ran dry of idea. Well, we didn't actually run dry of ideas. We had to figure out how to sequence prioritize ideas, because you had so many, and you had so many qualifications and I joke that you get a different certificate or licensure every time you have a new book coming out, and we have to sandwich like 3 more letters onto the cover.
Yeah.
But so
I do have more. I've not asked you to add them, but I am, I'm sort of a perpetual student in that regard.
I appreciate this courtesy. But so what is your recollection of how did the accountability book, which is How to Be Accountable, how did that come to exist?
So you can definitely correct me. We're both middle-aged, so maybe between the two of us, we'll get it right. And thank you for the happy birthdays, guys. I'm seeing them pop up. This is our commitment to this book. This is our birthday. So you had, and I should also probably preface this by saying it's not weird for Joe to text me. We are friends at this point, and we chat about shit all day because like my husband and Joe's partner kind of gets tired of us, so then we just bother each other. And we're also far more interested in shoe shopping than they are, so we have stuff to talk about there. And you were talking about your own, like the internal work you had done on your own accountability process after previous relationships, friendships, of like, okay, so what in this is mine? What if this was like, like poor boundaries, or, what do I need to take responsibility for? Like, how was I unkind to people or unknowing and these kinds of things? And you said like you had done a lot of work in that regard. And that was something that you were noticing over and over again, was like people were struggling with that most of you're nodding, so I'm getting this right, good. That most of what was out there is like, if you can do it sort of in the traditional 12-step model or whatever, but just people trying to kind of unpack that most of the books out there about accountability is how to hold other people accountable, which doesn't work too well. And so you were like, I want to put together a zine on this. And I was, was doing some reading, and will you kind of jump into this document and make sure that I don't look like a complete asshole? So I think I did some edits on the original, but not a whole lot. I think I added like some stuff about values, and I'd really have to go. I mean, we both slept since then. I didn't do a whole lot with that one. But just like, well, no, that's not really what that is. And like, let's talk about value systems and, alignment with that. And like, he put in a few things on that. But I think that one was really more your singular voice with just, kind of me popping up as Jiminy Cricket or whatever. And the zine had done really well. So you're like, yeah, I think this needs to be expanded into a book. And you said, but that's like, I know you're busy, like you're writing, like a book a week for us. So I've got it. Just kind of do the same thing and jump in on it. And of course, we weren't expecting COVID, pandemic, all the other things that were going on. And we both actually had, again, being middle-aged, fairly bad injuries during this time period. So we're both operating in COVID, and we're busier because of it, because, I'm a trauma therapist, you're a publisher, publishing self-help in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. So we're both a little busy. And I was injured for a while, and you were injured for a while. And if anyone has had any kind of health issues during this, you know how hard getting treatment is in the middle of a pandemic. So we were both like having these time periods of being really laid up and not being able to like just typically like, oh, I need to go get an fMRI and a steroid shot or whatever. So I think you're like, I have to tap out. Like, I'm really hurt. Will you kind of put aside the other stuff and work on the book? And I pulled it up and then changed everything.
Right.
No, that's not what that is. You know what would be way cooler than that? And so by the time you went back to it, when you were better, you're like, what the fuck is my book? So I think, and then you ended up going back in and saying like, excuse me, I would like to have some of my stuff back here. Right. And so a lot of the structure and I think stuff came from me just running rampant. And at one point, you were joking, like, I did 3 years of research for this book, and you're basically telling me like all I did was a really good outline. Because I'm like, no, that's not what it's called. That's the wrong word. No. So
right.
went back and sort of, and also Ellie has me pretty well trained. So I kind of structured it the way Ellie likes books structured, because she's been right thus far. My books sell really well, so she must know what she's doing or something. And so he kind of restructured some stuff around that and framed some stuff and added a lot more brain science, because that's my thing. And then you're like, okay, now can I put in some stories again? Like, okay, if you insist. So that was my recollection of how that book process came to be. Is we sort of almost had to like kind of like back our bikes into it, you know, like we didn't go straight in. We were kind of having to kind of get ourselves in there sideways. That it ended up being, I think, a really good thing because of that. I don't think that I would have gone in and changed as much and done as much to the structure if you weren't saying like, I can't move my body and I really need you to play with this for a while. Does that ring true?
So to my recollection, so I wrote this like revealing memoir about growing up as an autistic person called Good Trouble that came out in 2016. And because it was for our 20th anniversary of Microcosm. And I got so much fan mail from that. I mean, more fan mail than any book I've ever done before, which was awesome. But you and I joke that fan mail is 50% people asking for free consulting and 50% people telling you their trauma narrative, you know? And so, and the intersection of that book is basically this book, you know, that when people asked, you know, they would ask for like, how do I basically take a cold, hard look at myself and change fundamentally like how I respond to my trauma. And, you know, so it was sort of the perfect, like one part of each, you know? Mm-hmm. And so that was why I wanted to put together the original. And, you know, and partly because it was also like people were literally asking for exactly that. And then by the time we were putting this book together, the editor, Sarah, she looked at it and she was like, you basically need to throw away everything you have and start over and make it a whole new book. And, you know, there's just so many things that are missing and there's so much hierarchy that's missing. And so that was about the time that we hit our busiest year ever. And I really didn't have time to do that, but I had committed to do it. And, you know, it was so popular again that I was like, wow. And it is fascinating that you know, this book, like the book about like how to be your best self, and the other book that's popular this year is about like predicting the future. And I feel like that is 2020 in a nutshell, you know, but I feel like this has been, you know, the process of all that is like you picking up the torch and, you know, Sarah telling me that it's not good enough and all, you know, and then having a number of editors, you know, it really does make it a better book. Like it makes it come out as strong as it needed to be, you know? So it does, because I do, you know, like you said before, I feel like so much of the problem with something like this is like, most of the content isn't helpful. You know, most of the books in print, because part of writing a nonfiction book is reading every single book in print on the subject. And I mean, I feel like that was an incredible bummer. Yeah. You know, because I just was like, this one says the same thing that the last one said, which was nothing.
Which was saying, pray about it, and Yeah.
And I guess it's like the same thing as all of your books though, where like when I was growing up and I would like find a book about anxiety or boundaries or something, and I would try and read it, and it has like a nice white lady in a sweater on the cover, and I'm like, who is this for? It's like trying to be for everybody, but like in turn it's for nobody, you know? And I just couldn't, you know, find any of it relatable. And this was sort of the same way. So that was the other reason that I thought it'd be good to have you involved. And I'm glad you put a heavy hand to it rather than just, you know, like putting your name on it, you know, because I feel like, you know, you're at a point in your career as a writer where you could just have an army of ghostwriters, and that could be that.
I didn't know that was an option.
Anything is an option.
Yes. My life just got easier. Awesome.
But yeah, and then it just became then the gridlock of fighting the clock on this thing, because having to redo the whole thing, and during, you know, my busiest year ever, maybe your busiest year ever, it was not easy or fun. But let's get into the nitty gritty. So what is accountability?
Well, if you're going to read the definition, you're going to have to read it because I still don't have my copies. Speaking of COVID, just even getting things from the printer has been difficult. But the one thing I talked in there is, you know, responsibility can be like this shared event, right? Responsibility can be like, yeah, we didn't get the PowerPoint done for our class presentation. You know, this group of 5 people screwed up. And accountability is that very personal experience, not just of ownership of what didn't get done, but we're taking it to the, like, where is that coming from? Not just oopsie daisy, my bad, but I can't do that anymore. That's not who I am as a person. That's not acceptable behavior for me. And so I need to do that work. So, like, you know, the responsibility is like, we didn't get the group project done. The accountability would be like, well, you know, I perceived everybody else on my team is slacking off. And so I got really resentful. So I decided I'm not going to do mine either. So I didn't. And that wasn't a good way to handle that situation. And I would do that, you know, and I will handle that differently in the future or whatever. So to me, accountability is not just that I didn't do my part either, but this is where I was coming from. And that's something that I need to work on.
Mm-hmm. I think the way you jogged my memory, so I have a bit of an unfair advantage. I did not cheat and reread the book today or anything. And what, you know, and for anybody out there that hasn't written a book, like, by the time your book comes out, you've written it so many months ago that you've fully forgotten everything that's in your book by the time it's done.
And I'm working on 2 other books right now, so I can talk about those a lot. Yeah.
But the way we talked about it, accountability is when your actions are not in line with your values.
Right.
So essentially, like, you are not in turn acting as the person that you are, which is sort of like, you know, your being starts to come apart, you know, because it's like, if you care about something, that needs to be consistent with your behavior. You know,
the question I ask clients all the time is when they're like, well, I'm going to start hiding assets and that bitch, or, you know, whatever else is going on. I'm like, 10 years from now, are you going to be proud of your behavior, or are you going to be really embarrassed if you do that? You know, and like, you know, when we know better, we do better. There's been plenty of times where we've done something where we're like, dumb move, but we were doing like the best we could with what we had at the time. And that's a different experience of like, I knew better. That's what the higher self is, right? Your higher self is just the part of you that knows better. You know,
yep.
We can give it a spiritual name, but like, you know, what part of you knows better, and operating from that part and figuring out what kind of activates us falling out of alignment from that part. How, like, we talked a lot about the brain science and just the things, the heuristics that become involved in how we make decisions, and how, like, perfectly good people, you know, smart people with really dumb brains, you know, that we do and think and believe dumb shit because of how brains work, and how being aware of that and recognizing that is a big portion of fixing it. Like, if you realize that that's something that an error that you consistently make, then you can react for that, right? Like, if you know you have a blind spot, you've got to look past, you know, to make sure that you're not missing anything. And so we talked a lot about that in the book as well. Like, not everything is like, well, you know, fuck it, I'm just, you know, I'm going to take out a gallon of ice cream, even though that's, you know, not my value system or whatever. It's, how do we get to that point to begin with? It's not just, you know, evil, you know, twirling the evil mustache, but just all the stuff that becomes a problem, trauma histories, and all of those other things.
Right. And so, and that was the hole that I fell into the hardest, was researching all of the brain science around, like, where our brain is easily tricked, and why we fall for things like fake news, and why we believe the things we want to believe. And, you know, I spent so many months just consuming every inch of information about that. And 90% of that never ended up in the book. So if anybody wants some referrals on many, many things they can read, I have a long list. And actually, no, wait, that list is in the back of the book. So you have that at your disposal as well. But one thing that I was super proud of as well is, and, you know, and I hadn't really seen this elsewhere, the best books that I read on the subject, you know, that had been published previously, were all about workplace accountability, which seems like it'd be really boring and irrelevant. But those were the highest rated. And it's because essentially like they're the only ones that have had to actually create systematized thinking around it.
Mhm.
So it's helpful because it does talk about like what happens if someone is just like out of line with everyone else in an organization. And I've, like as doing activist organizing and doing any number of other things like throughout my life, I've been in that situation on both sides so many times where it's really hard when, somebody is sort of the black sheep and they don't know it, and how to have that conversation and how to, set like organizational or institutional standards. And I really was afraid that our book would sound a little too hand-wringy around that area, but I was really proud of what came out of it because it really talks about like the difference between like an organizational boundary, which is like, it's not okay to behave this way here, and personal accountability, which is like, I'm not behaving consistently with my own values,
Yeah.
and and I feel like that toes the line really well of like, we're all part of society. Something, in Portland, there's this whole like passive aggressive movement of like telling strangers how they should behave, or like leaving notes on the street that are like, if you park here, you're an asshole, or all kinds of things like that. And that doesn't really apply. Like, people try to make that into accountability, but it's not. It's like sort of somebody else being upset by somebody else's behavior because they're sort of putting it in a box of like ways that they've been maybe mistreated in the past. And and I felt like we did a really good job of bringing that back to like, when you are a society or an organization, or even just like people that coexist in the same building, there are certain behavioral standards, and there are certain things that like are maybe some, like the United States is a more flexible society. Like, we don't cane people for doing graffiti. We more allow different forms of personal expression and all that, like within a broader degree than a lot of places on earth. But there are limits to that too. And and I feel like that's acknowledged well and spelled out pretty well in the book, without it being too like self-hatey, or like, I feel like there's clear protocol if somebody wanted to actually
Bring in
solve a
systems
problem.
change. Yeah. So if people are looking like, okay, well, yeah, I'm doing my own work, but I am, a part of this org that we're having some issues. Will the book help me with that? The answer is like, we hope so. It was designed to, but behaviorally, call out culture and cancellation culture. And, there's that, how do we hold accountability without just shaming and stigmatizing and not giving people a chance to do the work? And we tell stories in there. There's stories in there about people who have, done the work in public ways, and people who have, just been like, yeah, I'm so sorry. And then they went back to their same crap. And I won't, name names here, but there's celebrity figures that come to mind and we talk about. Like, so how do we call people in? How do we create standards that are behavioral versus accusatory? The example in the book is about, hey, so, you showed up to group and Marisol said that she smelled alcohol in your breath, and when she asked you about it and asked you to leave because, this is a use-free zone, you spoke to her in a very loud and belligerent voice, according to her and a couple other people. And so we need to talk about that. This is a drug and alcohol free zone. So it's not saying you were drunk, you were screaming. It was very behaviorally, like, we smelled alcohol on your breath, on your personage. This was, the volume of your voice. Several people were uncomfortable with that when you were, asked to leave. So kind of, how do you do that in a way that is not then getting into, I wasn't drunk, I had just had and how do you navigate those, and how do you kind of create policies around those that are behavioral, so they're not about the person, but they're about the behavior. And so hopefully that will be helpful for people as well. And even how to, like, if you're having to have, and that's also in the consent scene a little bit too, if you're having to look at, like, you know, violations of that, how do you structure that in kind of a community organization? How do you have like a couple of people involved? You know, how do you have mechanisms to make sure that people are treated fairly and given opportunity to grow and change and be their ethical selves rather than just kicking everybody out every year,
Right.
having a whole new board or whatever, because there's which I think everybody's, you know, you and I have definitely seen, and probably everybody who is listening is probably, you know, seen organizations that work that way. And that's a shame, because it's people that are doing amazing work and it's people that are amazing people. But sometimes you know, those aren't tools that we're given, right? Like, those aren't things that you learn how to, you know, express behavioral concerns in kindergarten. You know,
Right.
so how do we, you know, and in fact, we tend to be a little overly polite and dismissive until we go kaboom. Of course, then I wrote a whole book about boundaries too, and talked about some of that stuff. So we tend to just throwing that pitch in there, because boundaries are such a big issue, and boundaries are our everyday expression of consent, and accountability is then, okay, so what happens when those are violated?
Yeah. And that, you know, and so we have a whole section on like the components of a good and a bad apology and how that works and what not to say and what the common mistakes are and why those things are or are not appropriate. And we have a number of examples. I felt like I did a very deep dive into looking at celebrities that I had previously not paid much attention to at all, and how they have publicly apologized or not. And that was really fascinating. And then as well, you know, I guess I just feel like for most organizations, they're so focused on the output and the function of the organization that they don't spend a whole lot of time on the human relational aspects of it. That those are, you know, they're very just focused on what the point of the group is rather than creating a functional group dynamic, which, you know, I could see both sides of that, like how you end up in those positions, you know, but you know, so we're focusing a lot on that because for most people it's an afterthought, you know. And so you also, I guess this will sound like a pitch, but I mean it more as an example of this in practice. So you recently made a holiday, Indigenous Noms is the title.
Yes.
Recipe book. And we
it is
had
a pitch because all that money is going to be going for food insecurity and fuel for Native elders. So we are pitching that because we're not keeping the money. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So and then you and I had a bit of a we didn't have like conflict between us, but we had quite an extensive discussion about the cover. You want to tell that story?
Yeah. So first of all, this zine came from, I had mentioned when I had defended my dissertation, I had brought in these Indigenous treats, things that, you know, I had grown up making, things that, you know, were traditional to Choctaw peoples and stuff. And my dissertation was on intergenerational, like it made sense, intergenerational trauma. And so I was sort of sharing food culture because was even talking about food and food culture within my dissertation. And Ellie's like, oh my God, those recipes would be such a cool zine. You should do that sometime in your copious, you know, spare hours. And so it only took me a year, but I put them together and I was like, you know, I'm happy to do that, but I'm not comfortable like making money off of these recipes and these stories. And so I'll donate the money. And, you know, so it was something that kind of we worked through. And then we came to, so what's the cover going to be? Because if anyone has like seen Choctaw molasses bread or what fry bread looks like, it tastes delicious, but it's not cute. So we were trying to come up with a cute cover, and being silly, like we ended up with it was an Edward Curtis image, and with like a big sort of white American like birthday cake on it. And to us it was funny, like knowing the history of the book and the history of Edward Curtis photos, and that, you know, we're sort of like playing on.
We should spell that out because people don't know that
Okay.
story. So he would he historically photographed Indigenous people, and he would often hand them a prop to make them look more indigenous.
Right.
You know, because it was really like the job was to do, you know, prop dressing for people because there was sort of an American stereotype even already at that time.
Right, 100 years ago, right. That, yeah, even just now, people are like, why are you wearing a sweater and jeans? Why are you not wearing a ribbon skirt and a shawl? Because it's cold. So like, we thought that was hilarious and kind of ties into the stories of the book. And then like an obviously un-Indigenous cake. And like, we thought it was funny. And then I think it was my husband's like, people aren't going to get that and people are going to get offended. And I'm like, I'm Choctaw, like I'm allowed, you know, I'm allowed to make fun of this. And he's like, yeah, but do you really want to be defending that? Do you really want to have to like then go back and explain the cover at the level of depth that we're doing now? And so you staffed it out to people. You sent it to some Indigenous people and some Nahulu people to see what their responses were. And the Indigenous people thought it was hilarious, got the joke, and the Nahulu people were super offended.
And I feel like that ties into the accountability book because the white people were offended on account of the Indigenous people who were not offended.
Right.
You know?
Like we thought it was hilarious and that was literally the point, but it was, if we're trying to make this for everybody, do we really want to have that conversation over and over and over again when we're already busy? But it was the like, have you, like, you know, have Indigenous people seen it? Yes, the author is, you know. So but that's when we kind of said like, okay, this is going to work, this is going to take too much time. But it was that sort of performative anti-racism, I guess,
right.
that came up with that. So yes, we ended up putting just a Turtle Island graphic instead.
Which is a different joke, but like a joke that doesn't really risk offending anyone.
Yes, but yeah, I mean, even within the book, it's like, I'm including this recipe for this reason. You know, I staffed this with native Twitter. You know, the council has agreed, and the elders have agreed. But right. just all, you know, sort of all, there's all these levels of people trying to be careful and do good right now that. You know, I keep hearing over and over, like, you know, that's probably not my space to be in right now. 10 years from now, when people have had voice heard, then maybe I could, you know, write a character that is not the same ethnicity. Like, I hear writers saying that, like, I need to not write characters that are not my ethnicity right now, and, you know, make space for that. And that'll, you know, once those voices are getting, you know, so people are having to sort of, there's a lot of, and we talk about that as well, as sort of like, you know, the public shaming and the cancellation culture and the things that John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, has been out for some time and speaks to that as well. But it was one of those, we have to pay attention to this. How much fight do we want to have about
right.
it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked for a long time about how to be accountable. So and maybe in the next 5 minutes, we could talk briefly about your other two books that are hot off the presses. Unfuck Your Year, which has been very popular pandemic pick because it's also about self-improvement that you can do in exercises on your porch all by yourself. You know, you don't need
or socially distanced with your neighbor. And so my husband is a peer recovery coach, and that's his favorite of my books. Like, he uses the shit out of that one, that it is, you know, it's very skill based. And I think that the original idea of the book is we were going to kind of pull a lot of activities I did from other books and make this one, and I am not capable of being lazy. So I did all new ones. I think it's like 90% all new activities. It's not just repeats of stuff from other books, because I just can't help myself. I have a PhD for a reason. Like you have to be a little bit crazy. So if anyone's like, oh, that looks really interesting, but like I have all her shit, so I don't need those again. It is really different stuff. And it was designed to be an unplanner. The idea of like doing self-work over a period of time rather than like, oh, well, here's my dentist appointment and I'm going on vacation. Y'all remember vacation before times when we left the house. And so obviously like the book was done and even came out before pandemic, but people really responded to it because it became a work that they could do that, you know, that it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to be home and I'm also dealing with the trauma of all this might be helpful to me. So I had people saying like, you know, my neighbor and I, we have like socially distanced coffee in the mornings and we're both working on Unfuck Your Year together. My husband's been using it a lot. In fact, he works now for Recovery ATX, which is a whole coaching organization and building curriculum. And he's basically just like stealing my shit. So that may end up being their curriculum book as well, because it's designed to be like, okay, this month we're going to work on anxiety. This month we're going, you know, to work on boundaries. And so there is an activity for every week to do that they sort of build over time. So you can, you know, you don't have to like, well, January you're working on boundaries. You can do that month whenever the fuck you want. So it's designed to work with however people want to work.
And that was just an idea I had biking to work one day, that we would just have a book of only the composite exercises spread out over
and
a
then
calendar year.
And then I don't
Faith
didn't listen.
And so you also have this other third brand new book, Unfuck Your Worth, that just came out as well because you're relentless. And so how is this book different from other financial planning books or personal finance books?
Well, I got the nicest love note from somebody who got a copy of the book, I think before even you and I got them in. The way things are being sent out, some bookstores got them before you and I did. And so like I was really confused and I had to take a minute. And it was a woman who was a financial educator. And she's like, oh my God, bitch, your book. She's like, every time people ask me what's a good book about finances, I have to say none of them. They all suck because none of them are dealing with the root problem. And your book, like, and so she's actually like created classes around it and she's recommended it. And she's like she my pimp now. She's like handing out this book at you know, Halloween or whatever. Cause the book was designed not to be just like, oh, here's how to make a budget. Like if that was the issue, there's plenty of books on that and we wouldn't be having problems. The book was about how we have money and worth tethered together and how to separate those back out. It's very much about trauma. That there's a lot of research that shows that not having money for a very small amount of time creates a very significant trauma response, not just like growing up, you know, with a low socioeconomic status, but even just like losing a job and being like super terrified for a few months, which a lot of people are going through right now, and how that affects your ability to then manage money, whatever money you have, and that we react from it. It's called, somebody was doing research on the Hexaco personality model, and it kept factoring out this thing that he couldn't identify that didn't fit, and he realized it was fear, that people had this fear reaction that had to be accounted for. So it's very much about all of those issues, because they can't write about anything without writing about trauma, because it's so much fun. So it was very much about that, and like, okay, taking that into account and taking your values into account and what your goals are, not what your mama wants for you, you know, not what society says that you should do. I would be a marine biologist if that was the case. But what do you want? And then using the budgeting tools. And even then there's always different ones. Like if you want to see like big progress and you need to see some, you know, things paid off, really do this one. If your brain works better this other way, do this one. You know, and sort of thinking about those kinds of things. And if you're thinking about picking up a side hustle, these are things to think about and be aware of, you know, sort of very pragmatically, like I'm everybody's auntie. Like, well, that's a really good idea, but you know, how much money do you need to invest to get that started? Kind of stuff. So the tools are in there, but it's also about how those issues come to play anyway. You and I both loving shoes, shoes, something that we prioritize and budget for. Other people, shoes is very low on the list. I don't understand them, but apparently they exist. So.
They live their life, we live ours, fortunately. Okay, cool. So that's there's a lot more. I mean, I feel like we could do an hour about each of these books because there's so much to each one of them. But we have some questions to attend to. Jennifer asks when she pre-ordered the book, has not received it yet, and is curious about this. So this is the other amazing timeline about 2020. If you didn't already take this away from all that we've said, 2020 has been an absolute mess in that we were behind on every aspect of production, and then the book goes to print, and then the printer is slammed because all of the work that normally goes to China is done domestically because they had outages. And then basically what we call the supply chain in publishing, which is like how something moves from like words in your ideas in your brain to printed books on
in
paper.
Jennifer's hand, yeah.
Is tremendously slowed down at every instance. But all the books are printed, all the books are shipping. And then the newest problem is just the interest in books is, I've never seen it this busy before. So it's just about getting them out the door and getting them into your mailbox. So
Jennifer, I don't have mine either, and I wrote it. Yeah, I don't have my copies either, and I wrote it, so I'm with you. And just so people know too, Microcosm always uses domestic, fair wage shops, so like one of the shops that you use, everybody got COVID, and so they were shut down for a while. And then when they kind of went back to work, the pallet of books were sitting there, and everybody kind of forgot about it, was using it as a table for lunch or whatever. And like the shop you use for the Boundaries cards, they closed down because of the fires in California, and so the cards ran late. But that's with the prices of using smaller shops and fair wage labor shops, is when you have something like this hit, they don't have as much infrastructure to bounce back from it. But and that's part of doing good work with good people. So that's been an issue too as well. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting mine too, so we'll probably get it the same day.
Right, I know, right? Huh? And so we have another question that is, how is this book different from other books of its kind? I'm assuming meaning the accountability book, since this question came in half an hour ago.
You want to answer that? You want to start?
Sure. So I would say most of the books that, actually, no, I would say almost every other book that has accountability in the title is about holding somebody else accountable, whereas our book is about holding yourself accountable. And I feel like that is weirdly something that there is a dearth of writing about. And I would also point out the most obvious thing is that you are the only person that you have agency over, is your own choices. And while you can reason and plead and talk to somebody else, you really cannot make them do anything. And more than anything else, you can't make somebody else ready or prepared for dynamic, gigantic life changes that they just don't maybe either see the need for or just aren't prepared for, Whereas, and so this book is like everything from the brain science of like how you fall into conspiratorial thinking to like how you only find information that reinforces your pre-existing views, whether that's like about the election or whether that's about like, a public figure, or whether that's about like, something like, chlorinating the water or whatever, and there's so much to that when you extrapolate that out, finding just what reliable information looks like and where it comes from can be really hard, especially when you're looking at yourself and having to look at yourself in the mirror,
And, and this one is also more generic in a good sense, that a lot of the other ones out there that are structured for self-accountability are tied into 12 steps. Or like, I love Russell Brand's book on recovery, is so good. And if you're a 12-step person, buy it, read it. But it's very specific to 12-step abstinence from people with, with substance use, or you're using Dharma recovery, so you're using you're using the Buddhist 4 laws or whatever. And this one is more, because I've had friends say, like, would this one be helpful because I've really been eating poorly, and so my diabetes is bad, and and so I've been having issue with that lately. And I'm like, yes, it is not designed for any specific thing. It could be for just speaking more nicely to people. It could be for an issue that you're trying to work on. That we wanted something that was not specific to, oh, well, like, this is just a book for assholes who don't want to be assholes anymore, because we all have stuff to work on. It's not for any specific problem. So hopefully that adds to the question as well.
And Sam asks, and Sam, who clearly understands our title development strategy here, asks, might there be an upcoming Unfuck Your Laziness or Unfuck Your Procrastination? Fingers crossed. I also have pushed Faith in this direction because Faith is the most productive person I've ever met in my life. And I think we need your secrets.
Well, Sam, I'm sure that now my evil overlords are going to add that to my development list. That is not like on my short list. There's stuff that I'm working on right now, but that's not, I think that there's probably stuff in there that would be of benefit to that, because, procrastination and those kinds of things was like, where is that coming from? And how do you work on your own accountability to yourself in doing the things that you want to do? So yeah, but we can add that to the development list, but like, not like, oh yeah, that's going to be out in March. I've got other stuff that's a year behind that I have to finish first.
Yeah, we're planning next fall, and it is filling up quickly. Okay. And so somebody, anonymous attendee, would like to know how the book addresses having reasonable expectations of other people's accountability. And, and one of the questions that I was going to ask you, Faith, is about sort of when to know to put forth effort into other people. You write about this a lot in Unfuck Your Intimacy, about intimate relationships, and sort of like kind of when to throw in the towel. So do you want to address that in maybe other kinds of relationships?
Yeah, and I think that comes down to boundaries, right? So that's not about a personal accountability, that's about boundaries. Like you've said, the only person we really have control over is ourselves, and we can ask people for other things. But like, even in the intimacy book, it's I feel blank when you blank, this is what I'm asking for. We don't make demands, we make asks. That you can control someone to a certain extent through, fear or whatever, but eventually you're going to have an issue. So to me, that's about what is, where are my hard limits here? And that gets more into a boundary discussion of, I have some flexibility with this. I know that they're struggling with this and they're working on it. And so I have some flexibility within certain limits that I am speaking to. And then these are my hard limits. So it's not you need to this, but like this is my boundary for me. So whatever they do with that is up to them, but you're establishing like where your bubble is. So it's like, well, I'm not going to have unprotected sex with you if you're having unprotected sex with other partners. It's okay. So I don't have unprotected sex with people that are having unprotected sex with other partners for my own safety. I don't do that. And so it's not about you need to this and you need to make sure that you're using a condom and a dam if you're having sex with other people. It's like I choose not to have any unprotected sex with people that have multiple partners and they're not using protection for my own safety. Right? That's a boundary. That's not holding somebody accountable, like you slept with them and you didn't use a dam. Oh my God. Right? It's about like, okay, so my choice then is I'm not going to engage in sexual intimacy with you, or I'm not going to do so without gloves, dams, and condoms. So it's more about establishing the boundary, like what is okay for you, where do you have flexibility, and where do you have to say no? And it's not you did this. It's like I can't. I can't do that.
Yeah, and that's how I would frame it too, is like, you can only, but, and you know, their question was like having reasonable expectations is like, and I would say you draw that from how invested this person is in your life and their behavior in the past, you know, because if this is something someone else has been struggling with, there isn't a lot of reason to believe that will suddenly change. But, you know, maybe like their investment in your continued involvement in your life is the issue, or maybe framing that as a firm boundary is the solution, you know.
And that's one of those places where sometimes if it's a sticky situation, like, hey, I love this person, I've had a relationship with them for 10 years, but I'm really tired of this bullshit, you know, that might be a place where therapy could be helpful for you. So you can really sort of pick out the intricacies with that with somebody. Or if it's somebody, you know, an active substance use, that you're going somewhere like Al-Anon, so you can get some support in that area of setting boundaries and trying to maintain a relationship. You know, my big thing with boundaries is this is very hard to do, but if we have to say no, this is a firm boundary. But if that ever changes in the future, I'm open to that relationship again. The door is not locked, the door's closed, but it's not locked, can be really helpful as well. Like, I would like to have a relationship as long as this boundary is being respected. So somebody may come back a couple of years later, you know, and are you willing to, you know, to put forth the effort of, you know, rebuilding that relationship? And you talked about that, some of your stories in the accountability book were about that as well.
Yeah, there's some of that. Cool. And we have another question about, and I have been this person in this story, about being labeled as a complainer or not a team player because of disagreements and calling out others' poor behavior. Okay. What do you think? Boundaries again? I'm gonna guess.
So my thing is, and I work with a lot of couples. A friend of mine who also is retired now, it was a couple therapists, just like, it's like you're standing in the middle of traffic opposing phase, and you have to like hold your own, and everyone's going 60 miles an hour. So that's probably what you're feeling like. You're like, but this is legitimate. Like, I'm not being an asshole. Like, this is a problem. My thing is saying, you know, I would go back to, like, say if this is a team or something, like you're going into work and you're like this is a problem, and they're like, stop bitching. Okay, so if I am worried about something and need to express it, what's the best way to express it? I tell, like, we're working with couples is like, how, because we're always going to have to say things to our partner or to a coworker that they don't want to hear. Like, it's not nice to hear shit about yourself. How can you best hear something from me that is not necessarily pleasant? Like, how can I express that in a way that you're able to hear it for what it is, as feedback? This is not criticism. This is not meanness. This isn't me being whiny. This isn't me being complaining. It's me saying, you know, I think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And so I always say, give it back to them. Like, okay, if I need to express something, how can you hear that from me? And then the good thing about that then is, then if you do that, if they say, well, I hear it best X, Y, Z, and so you're like, hey, X, Y, Z, and they get feathers ruffled, you're like, hey, I'm trying to do it in the way that you asked me for. Did I get anything wrong? Because I was really trying to follow what you said was helpful to you. And so you're just kind of giving it back to them and giving it back to them and giving it back to them. I think we all hear certain things better. And so you're caring for the relationship when you do that, rather than be like, this is just how I say things. You have to hear it. Like, I just, you know, I tell the truth, you know, of saying, like, I care about the relationship. I'm not going to stifle things that need to be said, but I want to say them in a way that you're receptive to, and then do that. And that's something that, you know, I do with couples all the time. And then when they do it properly, I'm like, hey, you did great. You did that. So are you hearing it? I know it still doesn't feel good to hear it, but you're hearing it, right? And it's really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have time for one more? Let's see. We have an inquiry about whether the research is included about how money makes people less cooperative, more likely to become self-interested, even when presented with equal options. I'm assuming this is in Worth.
Yeah, there is some read there about Worth book. Yeah. There is a whole chapter there about systemic wealth inequality. Just like I always have to write about trauma, I always get a little cranky about social issues. Yeah, I had an ex of mine had messaged me after Brain came out. He's like, like you would do so well if you just not be political. And I'm like, have you met me? Like, that's not gonna happen. Yeah, we're not going to talk about things without talking about how things. So yes, systemic wealth inequality is in there. The whole thing in there. Oh, what was it called? The affluenza. Like I talked about all of those things and issues with that, and not just even research in the U.S., but research in other countries. If that answers your question. There's a lot there, like that could be an encyclopedia. So, but I tried to speak to some of the bigger issues. It's not just about one individual person's relationship with money, but how like this is a systemic thing that we're all having to deal with. In fact, that was one of the questions is like, hey, you said, so if you're going to give people advice, like what's one good thing you could do for your finances in 2021? I was like, decolonize. And you're like, that's not probably the best answer. So I'm with you on that there is a lot of discussion about having to work within obviously a failing system.
Right. And looks like we have one more question and I think we're done. How do you hold yourself or your partner accountable without falling into blaming?
Okay. So again, that's about speaking to, and so this comes up in a lot of my books. It is in the intimacy book, which you mentioned, is speaking to I statements. And I statements also comes from the business world. It comes from Bolton's book, People Skills. It's something that's used as a management strategy. And then therapists stole it because like we steal everything. So rather than you this and you that, it's, I feel this when this happened. This is what I'm wanting. So not you made me mad. I was really frustrated when I asked you to do the dishes and you said that you would. And then when I got home, they weren't done. And this is, how I want that resolved. So it's accountability, but it's coming from your place of like, I'm taking responsibility for my emotions and my expectations. And I've had clients say, I feel that you're being an asshole. I'm like, no, it's not it. Let's try that again. But it really is. And I think that's a very powerful tool in general, not just with accountability, is taking responsibility for our emotional content. The story that I tell a lot, like of recognizing, like I'm having a strong reaction that other people may not necessarily have. Like this may not be a big deal for somebody else. And so I also need to, like, even if, my partner is being, kind of a pain right now, my reaction to it is still mine. And that's not letting people off the hook. That's a relational give and take. I'm a relational therapist. So, of telling my husband, yeah, that's a really good example. My husband is the one that does the dishes. He would kind of like wander off and forget to do them. And I'd come home like getting ready to cook dinner or whatever, and the dishes wouldn't be done. And my reaction, like, that's a frustrating thing, but that's not a really big thing to get outsized upset about. And I also recognize that like my love language is acts of service. And so I had tethered in you doing that means you love me. And so my reaction was more outsized by what I had ascribed meaning to. And so even explaining that in that context, like this has a lot of meaning for me. It's not just I wanted the kitchen cleaned up so I could cook dinner, but that is a recognition that this is something that's important to me, and I, that's something that shows love to me. And like he's really good about the dishes now. Once he understood like this has a level of meaning for me that doesn't have for him, because he's like, well, let's just go out to dinner. Who cares? I'll do them later. And so that kind of stuff can be really helpful to a relationship in general, I think, to, our emotions. Somebody can be a dick, but our response to it is ours.
Yeah, and I think that's like the sort of resonating theme in all of your books is that you get to choose how you behave and how you react to your emotions rather than no amount of programming or manipulation will change how other people behave, but you get to still be your best self, which
And sometimes that means having to let go, you know, and I have the conversation with clients. I'm like, okay, we're gonna do, you know, this, this, and this. I'm like, well, what if they don't respond? And then the answer is, well, then you have a decision to make about that relationship.
Yeah.
That I can't make for you. So I can be here for you, but I can't, you know, and that's, you know, what it comes down to, like, this is what you have control over. And, you know, clients like, but what if they don't? I'm like, well, then you have to make a decision about the relationship. Yeah. So
and I feel like that's, you know, I get a lot of, I mentor autistic young people, and I have a lot of other people that come to me with questions like this. And the answer is almost always like, well, the reason they treat you that way is because you didn't uphold the promise that you wouldn't tolerate this the last 16 times they behaved this way. And you kind of need to put your money where your mouth is, unfortunately, as much as none of you really want that, you know, which I feel like is part of it, you know, for a lot of cases.
It's tough. You're like, why don't people just stop acting so messy? Would be nice, but they're not. So we have to deal with our own mess. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it. Thanks so much for coming out. And I don't know if there's a way to get autographed books at this time, but you can get I think Faith has 30,000 books that you can all get from Powell's.
Mm-hmm.
And Faith will have even more new things by the time this video appears on YouTube. And I think we have a new one coming out together called the Autism Relationships Handbook. And then you have a new one coming out called Unfuck Your Body. And then you have, I don't even know all the books that you're writing right now.
The two right now, the body book, which is like, this is not do a yoga and be keto. It is about the body-mind connection. And so I have a postdoc in clinical nutrition. So it sort of speaks to, you know, the tie-in, like there's a lot, and it's heavy science. And that's why we're trying to, like, you know, like, you're making us throw up in your mouth with all the science. So that's the part we're editing right now, is I'm always trying to make science palatable, but, you know, understanding polyvagal theory, understanding inflammation and depression, those kinds of things. And I happen to like yoga, but you don't have to do a yoga. And then we're also expanding the anxiety book. That was the first one that we published. It was expanded from the zine, and we realized there's a lot of content that we could really add to that would be of benefit. So we're expanding that one out as well.
Excellent. Thank you both for joining us. I'm just reading this one comment where one of the listeners calls you both superheroes, and I think that is accurate. This has been such an amazing conversation. There aren't any signed copies right now, but I am positive that we will have Dr. Harper hosted here at Powell's again in the future in person. So if you live locally, you can bring your books in at that time to get them signed, and then we'll have signed editions at that point. So
I actually did the last in-person event at Powell's. I shut Powell's down. Like, personally locked the door and said, that's it. I brought Rona. Yeah, I brought an ice storm one year. I brought Rona the second year. So I think probably you're going to have to keep me on Zoom. Otherwise, you're going to have locusts.
No, I think we'll chance it and we'll have you back.
Ooh, correct answer.
Yeah. I mean, we have talked about trying to do like stickers where I can sign a bunch of stickers, because those could be mailed out easily, like book plates or something, which is something that's, you know, if that is something that would be amazing for people, harass Joe Biel about that, because he would be the one to infrastructure make that happen. I can totally like sign them, and then Powell's would, you know, have them available.
Okay.
Well, I shared some links in the chat today, and you can also just go to powells.com and search both of our authors to find these products. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we are having a sale this weekend, so it's a good weekend to stock up on books, in particular these books we've been talking about today. Their joint published book is How to Be Accountable. And Dr. Harper also has Unfuck Your Year and Unfuck Your Workout right now, as well as many other books. Again, it's been so fantastic to host both of you, and I'm sure we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Bye.